Even as India is gearing up for a 5G rollout, India's wait for 5G may get longer. You ask why? Let me explain. Now, this is because the telecom regulator has now declined to review spectrum prices that the country's debt-laden telcos have termed too costly to buy. Remember, it was in August when the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or the TRAI, set a base price of rupees 492 crores, around $70 million per megahertz for the 3,300 to 3,600 megahertz band, expected to be the primary band for the 5G services. Now the regulator this week declined a government request to review these prices, potentially which could lead to an auction failure. Now the Cellular Operators Association of India, or the COAI, the industry body that represents telecom operators, has now said that telcos, including the new entrant Rail Jio Infocom Limited, are altogether on this, saying that these prices are too high. If you look at Bharti Airtel, that has said that it would not participate in an auction held at these prices. If you look at Vodafone Idea Limited, they've also suggested that the 5G auction take place in 2020 and not currently. Jio, though has consensus on the board, has not made its plans public. Now the government, which is keen to see the 5G rollout, had last month asked the regulator to review the auction architecture, including reserve prices, to make sure the benefits of 5G reach social sectors. However, the regulator was not convinced. Now, even if you look at this problem historically, India has priced spectrum much higher than the rest of the world. In fact, in the last auction in 2016, the 700 megahertz band remained unsold, and the government did not auction any spectrum in 2017, 18, even 2018 and 19. Now, if you look at globally, look at prices in Australia or South Korea, 5G spectrum was auctioned at $5 million and $18 million per megahertz, respectively, in both Australia and South Korea. Now, against India's base price of $70 million, not just the lack of consensus, but it is also the lack of infrastructure that is holding India's 5G plans. A recent report has raised the red flags. Greater fiberization is necessary before 5G becomes a reality, and the already stretched telcos will have to invest at least 1 lakh crores in laying fiber networks in the next 3 years. So are we going to see 5G in the near future? What really is happening? To put this into perspective and also to help us understand what really are the telcos saying, joining us now is Mr. Rajan Mathews, Director of the COAI. That's the body that represents telcos in the country. Mr. Mathews, good to have you back on India Ahead. Now, the country and the government has a very ambitious target of a 5G rollout. They're saying that India is on the brink, very close to the 5G rollout, but India might still have to wait for a 5G rollout, as the telecom regulator has now declined to review spectrum prices, which the telcos have time and again said are too costly to buy.
Radhima, you're absolutely right, and we are extremely disappointed that in spite of making the case, both from international comparisons, as you rightly pointed out, in terms of also national policy, as you recognize the DOT and the government in an inter-ministerial approach, which includes the DST, includes the MEITY, includes the DOT, put together a high-level 5G committee to say how does India prepare itself to go forward. And one of the recommendations that came out of the high-level 5G committee was, please make the spectrum both harmonized internationally and available at a reasonable price. Now you go to the TRAI,
Absolutely.
and the other arm of government doesn't seem convinced that this is the way to go forward. So this is a disappointment to the industry.
Absolutely. Mr. Mathews, and at a time when India is looking to have, path-breaking innovations, we're talking about the rollout of 5G. This is going to be a big roadblock, because if the regulator has declined a government request formally to review these prices, this could potentially lead to an auction failure.
Nobody wants an auction failure. The spectrum is absolutely the fundamental building block for the nation to proceed in terms of both
Absolutely.
4G and 5G. It's like saying let's build roads and let's build bridges without cement and tar. It won't happen. So I think we have to address this fundamental issue of making spectrum, the raw material for progress on telecom, available at reasonable rates. So again, we get back to the nub of the issue, saying, why is it that two arms of government can't agree on the fundamental proposition that if India is going to compete globally, all nations, by the way, are going ahead with 5G and getting their telecom networks and their industries ready. We have that vision, but can't seem to be able to get our act together on spectrum pricing, which is a tragedy for us.
Absolutely. Mr. Mathews, I'll come to the divergent part of both the arms in just a bit, but I want to put this into perspective. All the telcos are on board as far as the, concerns regarding pricing is concerned, is what we are hearing. You have Airtel, which has clearly said what they feel. Vodafone Idea put together is saying that the auction should happen in 2020. Relgio, the newest entrant, is also on board. Have there been any specific demands that have been made to the COAI as far as the telcos are concerned?
I think the common request from our operators is to please continue to go back to the DOT and say, look, all of us agreed that these prices are fundamentally unsustainable. What got the telecom industry into the present problem, which is this tremendous amount of debt at 7.6 lakh crores, is precisely because spectrum was overpriced. So we are saying we're not going to be in a situation to replicate the sins of the past that got us into this situation. So if you're going to go forward in an appropriate fashion, all of us have agreed that, look, spectrum must be priced in an affordable manner, not lay on additional debt on the industry which it can't afford, and we will not be able to attract the additional investments after we pay these tremendous amounts of money. Redeemer, just take the math, right? 492 crore rupees. Everybody recognizes that for 5G to be successful, you need at least 100 megahertz of spectrum. That's 50,000 crore rupees off the bat. Now, where else is the additional investment going to come for our network equipment? So you can see why it's a non-starter.
Absolutely. Mr. Mathews, why is it a non-starter? The math is in front of all of us. But I want to go back to the point that you made about how two arms of the government are not on the same page. So clearly there is a divergence that's established for all to say. The government is saying the pricing does not make sense, but the TRAI is saying does not think so. They're saying everything is on track. Now the problem is when such a situation arises, it leads to a roadblock for the way forward. Now what is the way forward as far as 5G is concerned now when two separate arms of the government are clearly diverging on something which is supposed to take India forward vis-a-vis our global peers?
Redeemer, there are two bodies which reviews TRAI recommendations. Again, remember, TRAI makes recommendations. So the DCC, which is the Digital Commission, which composes of secretaries from the various departments, does review it, and they can make a decision whether to accept, reject, or change. In addition, the inter-ministerial group, which constitutes cabinet ministers from all the various industries, can also make a decision with regard to the appropriate pricing of spectrum. They have in times past, when the TRAI did make a recommendation on pricing, choose to reduce it. So we are hoping that these two bodies will review it, look at it, and perhaps make the right decision for the country.
Okay, Mr. Mathews, I said this while I began the show as well. Now, historically, India has priced spectrum much higher than the rest of in the world. In fact, I put this statistic out when I started the show that in the last auction in 2016, if you look at the 700 megahertz band, that remained unsold. Haven't we learned our lessons to put the pricing and the math in place to move forward now?
Redeemer, you're absolutely right. We should have learned our lessons. The industry certainly has learned our lessons the hard way. The predicament that we are in and the steep financial distress principally comes from the fact that we overbid on spectrum. Obviously, the quantum of spectrum was limited, but yet we had to go forward in terms of providing the service to our customers. Again, I don't think the industry is ready to commit that same sin and crime again. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to go back to the drawing board and ask the government to take a strategic decision, which what we call industrial policy. And after all, the US said we want to go to the moon. And then they decided all the enabling technologies and incentives and investments that are required. I think industrial policy says we want to go ahead with 5G. Let's make the appropriate decisions to make sure that we can achieve that.
Absolutely. Mr. Mathews, I read somewhere that, you said the problem is not the 5G roadmap. It's the fact that we need to look at the basics because the entire country is not even on 4G and we're talking about a rollout for 5G. Do you think, there are some sort of gaps in the basics as far as the roadmap has been concerned? Because if 4G is not something which is available to everybody in the country, does that push back our rollout time for 5G as well?
So I think certain things, Redeema, have to be done in parallel, and I think the government is doing the right thing in doing those things that are appropriate in parallel. So clearly, we must focus on 4G and make sure that every citizen of India has the ability and the approach to be connected to a 4G network and the internet. At the same time, the government has done the right thing and saying is that what are the enabling things we can be doing before 5G gets ready for market. So in addition to making sure that we are harmonized internationally on spectrum, we've looked at the policy issues, we've looked at the licensing issues, we've looked at the regulatory issues, we've looked at the right-of-way issues, we've looked at all of these things that need to be done before one can proceed on actually rolling out 5G services. So I think when we look at this, I think the government has done the right thing in terms of preparing ourselves. The issue is that as we go forward, one of the enabling things is spectrum, price right, put it into the hands of the operators to make sure that when the time is right to roll out these 5G services, we're all prepared from all angles to proceed.
Right. Mr. Mathews, lastly, before I let you go, now that, there is a sense of divergence between what the telcos are asking and what the TRAI is saying at this point of time, what is the way forward? If a formal request by the government has also been rejected at this point of time, where does that lead the rollout plan for 5G as far as India is concerned?
So I think without the fundamental issue of the spectrum pricing being resolved, I think we put ourselves at a disadvantage. Of course, the intermediary issues can continue. We can still continue to work on formalizing the right-of-way rules. We can still work on making sure that the IPR is being generated in India. We can talk about Make in India in terms of the sensors and all of that. We can still talk about applications. We can still talk about the 5G test beds. So there's a whole lot of preparatory work that we can be doing and will continue to focus on doing. But ultimately, if you're going to look at success in terms of 5G rolling out, we have to address this issue of 5G pricing and spectrum availability, because even when you're testing for the applications, you need to know upfront which bands are going to be available for being able to test and at what price will it be made available. So those are critical decisions in terms of ultimately being able to get to the finish line on being ready commercially for 5G.
Absolutely, Mr. Mathews. Always a pleasure chatting with you. So there's some red flags being raised as far as the roadblock are concerned for 5G and the roadmap for 5G. Slipping into a very short break, coming back with lots more.